Once again, friends, I am just so happy to be with you today. And I want to take a moment to lay out what our morning is going to look like. Today we are exploring the spiritual, ethical, and practical implications of artificial intelligence for ourselves, for our churches, and for our futures. For many of us, it has felt like AI kind of just stormed onto the scene in the last 2 years. As our digital spaces have become flooded with non-human content created by things like ChatGPT, which wrote my intro, and image generators like Midjourney, which generated my tie today, and any advertising that you may have seen. The prompt, by the way, is whimsical depiction of a machine learning algorithm that could be used for a poster. And this is what it came up with, which I thought was very nice. And I'd love to talk about the ethical implications of using a machine to create art instead of paying somebody to do it. But we'll do that in a minute. You know, I find myself counting the fingers on every image that I see on Facebook these days because the image generating AIs can't quite seem to get that right yet. And it's only a matter of time before real images and fake images are indistinguishable from one another. But even though that this new generative technology is so powerful and seemingly disruptive, those who have been in the tech world know that AI has been with us for a long, long time, working behind the scenes to power our modern world. From traffic lights and search engines to hospital triage and the COVID vaccine, AI is at the heart of so much of what we take for granted in the modern world. So as we outsource our problem solving to more capable machines, are we creating more equitable systems, or are we amplifying our existing biases? Will AI help us to rise above our foolish prejudices, or will it give false credence to the worst parts of ourselves? Who is teaching morality to machines? And whose morality do we teach them? Like if a self-driving car is going to either hit a child or an elderly person, who do you tell the machine to save? And who do you tell the machine to sacrifice? Now, a 2016 study out of MIT showed that people in America would prioritize the child, whereas people in China are more likely to prioritize the elderly person. So whose ethics do we teach to the machines? Whose morality ends up in the code? To help us untangle some of these messy questions, we have assembled a panel of Eastern and Palmer faculty and alumni who are going to come forward in a few minutes. Then afterwards, we will take a short break and invite our keynote speaker, the Reverend Dr. Erin Rafferty, to come share with us her very exciting and immediately applicable research on using AI and video games to foster more effective ministries for people with developmental disabilities and neurodiverse communities. This is our third year hosting this event, and I have been consistently blessed by the unique synergy of academic rigor and ministerial impact of these sessions. This is not just hypothetical thought experiments. This immediately matters to us, to our churches, and to the people that we serve. So if you were not present for previous symposiums, I would invite you at some point in the next few days to visit Palmer Seminary's YouTube page, where there are a number of playlists of all of the previous sessions that we've done for the past 2 years. We've discussed astronomy, medical ethics, eco-theology, evolution, and gene editing, and those talks are available to you at any time. Or if you're a professor, available to your students as well. And so without further ado, I would like to invite our panelists to come up and take a seat in front of your name, preferably. And as they do, we will open by asking each of them an opening question. We'll give each one as much time as they need to answer that opening question. And then after all three have answered, the floor is yours. Both you here in person and you there on Zoom. If you're on Zoom, please write in the chat or in the Q&A section. And you can either address it to an individual or to the panel as a whole. So it is my honor and privilege to introduce to you Dr. Gregory Longo, who is an assistant professor of data science at Eastern University. His teaching interests revolve around helping students discover ways to answer their own big questions using data. Much of his research has utilized a variety of statistical methods to explore individuals' religious and spiritual experiences, or lack thereof. Professor Amy Huddell is the lecturer of computer science at Eastern University, teaching at both the undergraduate and graduate levels. Her past research has been focused in machine learning, specifically fairness and bias in machine learning algorithms. And the Reverend Dr. Andre Price, yes, congratulations, the recently doctored Reverend Andre Price, is a visiting assistant professor of theology at United Lutheran Seminary, adjunct professor of theology at Palmer Seminary, and senior pastor of Mount Olivet Tabernacle Baptist Church, and he sleeps sometimes. His research has focused on theological and religious ethics and how they affect the everyday lives of marginalized people. So thank you, all three of you, for joining us today. And Greg, would you get us started? Can you explain to us non-experts what is artificial intelligence, and why does it seem like it's coming at us so quickly all of a sudden?
Great. Well, first, can everybody hear me all right? Is this good? Wonderful. Well, first, thanks for having us. Thanks, everybody, for being here, taking interest in this. I'm really excited to have this discussion that usually I force 18 to 22-year-olds to have when they're tired and don't want to be in class. So it's wonderful to have a less captive audience here. So the question, what is AI, is a really, really good one. I actually want to start with some audience participation. So can I get two, maybe definitions of AI from folks who are not maybe students who have taken a class in this before? Anybody? There's no right answer. There are wrong answers. Yeah, there we go, we got one.
Maybe I would say like complex computing systems or networks that can take vast amounts of data and produce conditional results for each example, for each output.
Okay.
That change and potentially get more accurate over time.
Okay, good. Anybody else? Well, that was hard. Let's try an even harder one, which is before we get to artificial intelligence, we kind of need to talk about what intelligence is. So what is intelligence? Anybody? Any psych majors? No. Well, oh, okay, go ahead, Laura.
Ability to adapt.
Ability to adapt. All right, Piaget. Anybody else? Okay, well, you might not have been willing to voice your opinion. You were probably thinking about some of these things, coming up with your own definitions. And there's no right definition, like I said. It's really, really vast what these definitions are. And so I like doing this with my undergrads. It's just, what is intelligence, and going from there, because we can't get to the artificial if we don't have some kind of idea of what the intelligence is in the first place, right? So if we want to take this, going way back, in 1950, one of the first real popular ways of thinking about what artificial intelligence was created by Alan Turing. It was the Turing test is what it came to be called. And the idea here is there would be a human who's the interrogator, and there would be a AI or some kind of, didn't quite use that language at the time, but some kind of artificial being and a human. And the person, the interrogator, would write down a question or something, give it to the black box, and behind the scene, either the machine or the human would respond. And if the interrogator could not tell which one was a machine and which one was a person, then it is said that it has passed the Turing test. And for a while, this was one of the kind of landmarks that people were waiting for. However, today we probably have a very different idea of what AI really is, right? A little bit more all-encompassing definition. And one of the reasons to bring up this Turing example is many of you probably had this feeling when you were interacting with ChatGPT or other large language models, as you're talking to this computer and you're like, oh my gosh, this is kind of almost real. Like, is there consciousness? I've had that question asked to me a bunch of times. So more modern definitions go from kind of weaker or the soft AI to harder AI. So the weaker AI would be things like Siri that are narrowly tailored to one or a small number of use cases. Then on the more complex side is where I kind of find myself when I'm thinking about what artificial intelligence is. I'm in this camp, which is the more general AI, which is some kind of reflection, creation, simulation of what human intelligence, cognition, personality, all of what it is that it means to be us, what that is. And we've got the Turing test done, we've got some uses of the soft AI, but this general AI we're a ways from. We're starting to see improvements though. So ChatGPT used to just be ChatGPT, and very soon it is going to be released with the ability to speak, to have computer vision, so it will be able to see things. The capabilities are just expanding very, very quickly, as we'll talk about in a minute. But one thing in the definition AI to point out is basically if you're not a big tech company, they're not doing AI. So when you see these people advertising that they've got AI in their recommendation system, they're using machine learning that we could probably do in 5 lines of code if we had the data. So it's nice what the products are, but don't fall for the AI nonsense at this point. So why does it seem like this is advancing so quickly? And many of you, if you're not, a computer science professor or somebody in the field, you might somewhat naively be thinking that it's advancing quickly. And that's because it really is. It's actually not naive to be thinking that. And there's a bunch of reasons for this, but briefly I'll kind of lay out the path. There's 3 main reasons that all relate to each other. So the first one is the increase in compute power. You all know this, our computers, our phones, all of that can do more than they've ever been able to do before, and in a relatively brief amount of time. I remember I was the coolest because my phone had a grayscale snake game on it before anybody else's. You remember that? And it gets a dot and the tail gets a little longer. It was the coolest, trust me. And so compute power has increased exponentially over time. At the same time, we have a lot more data, in part because of that compute power. So just big data is all over the place. If you're on Amazon, everything you're doing, everything you're clicking on is getting stored in a database to help their predictive algorithms. Although they still suggest that you buy a toaster, it suggests you buy 7 more toasters, but that's neither here nor there. All the data are being collected on any of these sophisticated platforms. Anywhere where the data is going to be helpful to their business, they're going to be keeping it. If you're on Casper.com, they're probably not going to be, well, they will, but they're not really going to be using the data. They want to be, but those kinds of systems like Amazon are going to be collecting all the data possible. And then the third part there, again, related to those first two, is just the increase in the sophistication of the algorithms that are being created. So researchers are able to use the part 1 and part 2 to just get better and better and better. This is where you see the emergence of fields like data science and others that allow us to just make sense of all the data and use the compute power. And this, of course, has led to a tremendous amount of marketing opportunities for folks, for businesses, and also then just leads to us seeing it so much more. So indeed, it really is that powerful and that growing that much more quickly than it has before. So overall, what's AI? It kind of depends on the definition you're dealing with, and it's really growing because of those 3 things.
Thank you. Amy, can you explain some of the potential issues concerning bias and fairness within these algorithms?
Yeah, so there's a tendency with machine learning algorithms to say, this is a computer, it's making an unbiased decision because it's a computer. But behind the scenes, these algorithms need to train on data. And if they're making real-world decisions, they need to train on real-world data. And that real-world data is often biased. And there's a couple reasons for that. But these algorithms can make really, really biased decisions and have a big impact on the fairness of the results of these algorithms. So some of the classic examples are, there was an algorithm, I'm not going to remember any of the years or companies that made these algorithms, but there was an algorithm that was created to predict recidivism, and it was found that it unfairly, it had more false negatives, so it more frequently said that an African American would recommit or commit another crime than false negatives for Caucasians. So it was more accurately predicting for Caucasians than African Americans. There have been studies of, was it Amazon that made an algorithm a hiring algorithm to kind of weed out initial applications for their jobs, and it was classifying less qualified men as better options than more qualified women, and things like that. So there are these, and these algorithms are being trained on data from biased people. So you have these, there are judges that made decisions for years and years and years that the recidivism algorithm trained on, and learned the biases that were there in the data. And same with the Amazon data. So there's human bias that exists in the data. There's also, the data is also not always fair. You have skewed data. You have more data for minorities or less data for minorities, and that causes fairness, or I guess I should say bias, in the algorithms. But the key to remember there is the data has bias or is biased in some way, and then the algorithm is going to learn that bias. So just because it's a computer making the decisions does not mean that the decisions are perfectly unbiased behind the scenes.
And Andre, what sort of impact do you see this sort of technology having on our churches and the people that we serve?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And so I really had to give some thought to this question, because in asking this question of AI's impact on our churches and the people we serve, I think it's important for us to remember that the churches, right, when we ask this question and think about people, right, that our churches are not homogenous, right? Our churches are rooted in particular contexts. And so I think the impact of this technology, right, impacts communities differently across different contexts, right, different socioeconomic status, so even as you were talking in terms of bias. And so I think it'll have an impact in one area, or it raises questions around specifically issues of preaching, just to name one. So Zach, even as you were kind of giving your intro, and then you let us in on the fact that ChatGPT wrote your intro, right? I think as people become more familiar with this software, that kind of ethics around preaching is definitely something that we have to think about. Especially as virtual church continues to kind of hold sway in the American imagination, as people are less inclined to actually physically go to church, and people are streaming, and there's a plethora of churches, preachers, ministries all over the internet. I can see this as continuing to be an issue and raise questions for us. I also think that sustained reflection on AI at some level is, and I'm thinking specifically in terms of the African American tradition, is at some level a kind of middle and upper class luxury, right? To be able to kind of even have a space like this where we're doing this kind of secondhand reflection. I think in kind of marginalized communities, there's a way in which kind of the existential crisis that people face and kind of the quotidian and the everyday is really what drives people, right? And so, for example, in my own tradition, we're really not having these kinds of conversations around artificial intelligence. We ought to, right? But there's a way in which there are kind of socio-political and socio-economic demands that kind of take precedence, right? Where this conversation is really the average person in the pew is not even in their mind's eye, right? And really, in a lot of kind of more marginalized traditions, there's, right, even just kind of environmental concerns and thinking about that theologically, right? People are just kind of getting around to that. So there's a way in which I think like things like ChatGPT will make that, it'll keep these issues in the faces of people in ways that maybe previously certain communities were kind of slow to get there. And I think as that continues to happen, it will continue to, people will continue to kind of impress these questions upon the church. But I also think, right, that this kind of technological innovation also serves as a kind of catalyst for us to kind of, for the need for us to kind of rethink the foundations of our Christian confession and Christian witness, right? That this whole conversation brings up questions around what does it mean to be human? What does it mean for us to be created in the image of God, right? Even in terms of things that are happening in experiments and advances in science around even kind of transhumanism, posthumanism, right? It keeps bringing us back to this question about what does it mean to be a human, right? Which is a central question for our Christian witness. And so I agree with somebody like Ilia Delio, who says that we need to have a new theology that declares, or one that aligns with our current understanding of cosmology, evolution. I would add AI, right? She talks about quantum physics. And so there's a way in which I'm very scared of where this technology is going, but then also understanding that right, kind of technological and scientific advancement, right, is also a gift of God in some respect, right? And so thinking about how do we keep those two things in tension, right? And what is our call as disciples, right, in living out our everyday lives, right, with that tension, right? Because we've also can see and name examples where technological advancement has been misused, right? And those who find themselves kind of on the fringes of society have been the victims of that misuse, right? And especially here at Eastern, where the motto is faith, reason, and justice, right? How do we act justly with this new technology? And I think those are some of the questions that are before the church as this kind of technology continues to advance.
Thank you. I would like to invite anyone who has a question here in person. Sorry, we had to move the mic because it was right in front of the speaker. That's on now. I would like to invite anyone who has a question to come forward to the microphone and ask that. If you are on Zoom, feel free to type that into the chat. Chat's not working.
I just told him to send me this question and I would ask him.
All right, well, somebody, there we go. Attendees can chat with everyone. Panelists can chat with everyone. All right. Attendees can chat with. While I fix this, can somebody in the room get us started? Come up to the microphone.
Hello, I'm Caden. I'm a junior, and Professor Huddell is my professor. I don't know. So I had this question mainly for Reverend Dr. Andrew Price, but you guys can also answer if you want. But with like this AI thing and people, there may be people who don't who think like ChatGPT is like 100% true and whatnot, whereas like it can't spell like words backwards and whatnot. What happens when like, say someone from your congregation or someone is trying to seek advice in scripture or something like that, and they want to go right to the AI? Like, what is your advice for that, or what do you tell them? Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah.
And then, like, as a side note, have you used it at all? And, like, not saying, like, you use it for advice, but are there ways in which you've used it in the pastoral sense?
So thank you for those two questions. So I'll start with the latter question, I guess. And so no, I've never used it except for the few instances where I've thought that possibly students were using it on their final exam. And so that meant that I had to kind of play around with it to see how it worked. And
They would never do that.
Yeah, and after about 10 minutes of figuring out different ways to put in the prompt, I was like, if they used it, whatever, because it's too much. I personally am a book person, and so I still am the type of person that actually needs a hard copy book in their hand. So I'm not a fan of like ChatGPT, but for others who may have kind of basic questions, right? If they use it, that's fine. I don't berate people or beat people up about it. It's personally not for me. And then your first question in terms of the congregational question, yeah, that's kind of my question too. Like when some of these what ifs, right? We seem to be in a moment where this technology is advancing, but we're not sure about all of its potential. We're not sure about its pitfalls, and so I think we have to be very careful in terms of, I think, how we use it and how we deploy it. I think we also kind of have to ask some more maybe kind of meta ethical questions around, like, in using this technology, what kind of people does it turn us into? And in answering that question or thinking about that question, right, the kinds of people that we turn ourselves into by giving ourselves over to this technology, does this glorify God, right? Are the kinds of people that this turns us into, are these the kinds of people that God desires, right? I think there's also questions around issues of power, right? The lack of power. And so the more I think about AI, like Chris Rock, I can hear Chris Rock in the back of my head talking about, right? There are some things that we can do, right? But we really have to ask the question, is this a good idea, right? And that's kind of what I'm asking, right? Is this a good idea, right, to advance this technology in this way, even for all of the potential positive uses for it, right? Is this something that we ought to be doing? And does this lead towards human flourishing? Or, right, is this kind of a Pandora's box, right? While it has some good uses, in the end, right, is this going to do more harm than good to my neighbors and those who are most vulnerable in society?
Yeah.
And I fully agree with everything. One of my many billion-dollar ideas was Faith GPT. There will be something like that coming out at some point, where somebody's going to build a model that is specifically for people of faith, and it's going to be used, or I would think that it will be used almost as a Sunday school kind of assistant, right, where it's trained to generate the kinds of responses that we want it to and that we want it to stay away from certain topics. I certainly think something like that would be reasonable for most of us, right? I think that could even be a good thing if it's used as an assistant, as opposed to trying to steer you into some direction that's not good, right? I know for a lot of us in higher ed, I'm certainly been thinking about the uses of ChatGPT to help people as kind of a personalized learning assistant. And if we could do that for Sunday school, I think that would be great. As we're going to hear later in the keynote, one of my daughters has Down syndrome, and if there could be an assistant that could help her understand things, be with her to get questions repeated, all that kind of stuff, it could be great. My father has dementia, same type of thing. Like, there could be really great opportunities there as long as there are guardrails. Now, there are going to be problems because there are very, I don't know if you guys know this, there are theological disagreements that people have. I know, I'm breaking ground here. And so, somebody's going to get very upset when the theology of the model is not what theirs is. But especially at the lower level, it seems like that could be a real solid use.
So I have a comment, an example, and then a question from Zoom. You mentioned this. Have any of you used or heard of the Chat with Jesus app? No. It's only on iOS right now, and it uses the data from ChatGPT to create a model based on the writings of Scripture, so you can talk to Jesus and ask Jesus questions and talk back and forth to Jesus based on, what the data says. Now, if you pay the premium subscription, you can also chat with the devil and others such as Mary Magdalene and some other people. Jesus is free because, free salvation and all that.
Why not?
So somebody is already stealing your idea. You need to get on it.
I know.
Secondly, our Jewish siblings have a wealth of tradition that starts with the Scriptures and then is expounded upon within the Mishnah, and then the Mishnah is expounded upon in the Torah, and the Talmud. Sorry. And the Talmud can take up a whole bookshelf of just that, and it will take rabbis a lifetime to study all of the different commentary that connects this to that, to this, to that, to the other, and the historical things, and you need to have a rabbi who is well versed in that. There are now systems which have been trained on the Talmud and Mishnah and the Torah and all of the other traditions, such that you no longer need those people. And now it is a lot easier to find all of the references to all of the things in order to connect dots that otherwise had to be done by a very wise person and now can be done by you on an app. So the question from Zoom comes from Christina Frazel and says, what does it look like to use AI to interpret Scripture? And this goes beyond just the generative AI. What are the possibilities for us as biblical scholars, as Christian leaders, that we might look forward to or be able to use right now even?
There's the field of computer science that studies textual data in machine learning contexts is called natural language processing. And so there are a lot of interesting ways you could train a model on the Bible. And in grad school, I trained a model on the Bible to try to write its own Bible verses. It did not work. It just kept repeating Moses' name over and over. I still don't know why, but so there are a lot of interesting ways that you can kind of train models on textual data, but only the Bible, or the Bible and commentaries or something like that, and kind of find connections between things that you didn't before, or find you could do sentiment analysis and find out what passages in the Bible speak positively about Gentiles and what passages in the Bible speak negatively about Gentiles, or something like that. So there are a lot of cool potentials there is a lot of cool potential for just comparison. This might not even be answering the question because I'm not talking about interpretation, but just learning things about the text as a text could be really interesting.
Yeah, and I'm going to break that down in kind of what I was saying before, between the strictly informational side and then the experiential side. And the informational side could be fairly easy, kind of like what you were talking about in the NLP. And I'm really curious where people take this in the experiential side of things. I could see some people saying that they don't want to have, or that it's not a real experience if you're talking with an AI and I don't know, you're feeling closer to God after that experience for whatever the reason, right? Or there's some kind of technological something that's related to AI where you're feeling that, and whether that's real or not, and if that's okay, and if it is not. And so that side is the real kind of, I don't know, that's the iffier side to me. But I would also like to step back a little bit and try to place this technological advancement in context compared to all other kinds of technological advancement, right? We have already, the use of the internet has maybe hurt, but it's possibly also helped a lot of people in their faith journeys, right? They're able to find communities, they're able to ask questions, get questions answered that they're looking for. Again, maybe it's good or bad sometimes, but you know, all of the technological advancements and the ability to watch something on TV, or zooming it, or having a car that could allow you to go to a congregation further away than one that you would have to, you know, just walk to or something like that. So we don't want to think that this is the only time where we've faced real changes and be totally scared of it, because we have had a lot of technological changes in the past that have impacted how we've interacted. And I mean, we still are all here. So try to keep that in mind.
Good morning. My name is Dr. McCauley. One of the questions I have by way of follow-up on this conversation, if folks are turning to AI for interpretations of Scripture, turning to AI for moral guidance, talking with Jesus, how ought we think about, and maybe this is for Reverend Dr. Price, how ought we think about the role of the Holy Spirit as folks engage with both AI and Scripture and have potentially personal encounters with God?
Yeah, so that's a very good question, and one that I haven't thought about. So thank you. So I think in relation to the scriptural question and the work of the Spirit, I think somehow we would have to maybe ask the question how the Spirit kind of mediates that encounter. For me, one of the things that the Spirit does is kind of serves as a mediator, right? I guess even thinking of maybe the way that Augustine talks about the Spirit as being the bond of love between the Father and the Son. I mean, I don't want to foreclose on what the Spirit can do and how the Spirit might be able to work through technology. But yeah, that's a really interesting question, right? So for me, right, that question again kind of brings us back to having to kind of rethink the kind of fundamental structures of our Christian faith and confession, because, right, even as culture shifts and changes, right, that means that our theologies are also impacted by those changes and those shifts in terms of relating our faith to our experiences in the world that we live in. And so because artificial intelligence, right, is not on the minds of the biblical writers, it's not on the mind of the patristic writers, right, it's not even on the minds of the reformers, right, this technology introduces something new to us, right? And we're still trying to figure out how does this kind of fit into our world, into our experience, right? And what does that mean for how people of faith live in the world? But I think in terms of thinking about the Spirit, right, there's some way in which I think would want to maintain that the Spirit still leads and guides in all truth, and somehow might use this technology as a way of doing that. But yeah, that's a really good question that I would have to think some more about.
I'm Chuck Wormington. I'm a biophysicist and a clinician, and I'm an emeritus professor at South University. My experience with AI and with ChatGPT has to do with medical issues, but very concerning moral issues have come out of that. AI is capable of so-called hallucinations, meaning that it makes up things at times. So in the medical field, that's very concerning. And sometimes it has references for what it says, and some of the references are completely made up. They are bogus. They are not real. So that's, again, a concerning thing. So when you transfer that into questions of how it's going to affect us spiritually, that's very concerning. So I don't want hallucinations to be a part of what I'm taking in. AI in medicine has been very useful in terms of interpreting CT scans and lots of other things for us, but it does have these moral issues. So what do you think about that in terms of how it affects what we might learn from it spiritually, in addition to its learned bias?
I think anyone who uses it needs to first at least understand the basics of how it works so that they can be aware of those types of hallucinations. So for something like ChatGPT, right, it's all that it's doing is predicting the most likely next word. So it's not understanding the meaning of what it's saying. So if the most likely next word is a hallucination, it's going to go with that even though it's wrong. But there is an issue if somebody goes into like interacting with ChatGPT without knowing what it's actually doing, then there's the chance that they kind of interpret it as fact, as like unbiased truth, and that's just not how it works. And I mean, even when I'm interacting with it, I start to struggle. Like I can't give it commands. I have to say please, and I don't know why. I know that it's a machine, but there's a tendency when you're interacting with it it sounds like a person. And it sounds like it knows what it's talking about, but it's just predicting the next word. It doesn't know what that word means. So that it's hard to keep that in mind while you're interacting with it. But I think if we have to, otherwise we get stuck believing these hallucinations, which could have pretty disastrous effects.
But I would say it also is important not to be too captivated by the moment. And these things have already got so much better. So a year ago, we had a faculty workshop where people said, well, it doesn't even do citations. And then literally the next faculty workshop, I was like, well, it's doing citations. And it's not always right, but it's getting better and better. And like it was ChatGPT 2.5, then 3, now we're up to 4. And every time there are substantial improvements. So in terms of the hallucinations and things like that, I would say give it a little bit of time, right? It's not quite ready for prime time in many ways like that. But I guess the question, the bigger question then, is this right or wrong factually, is when it comes to questions where there is no right or wrong necessarily, when there are theological questions and things like that, where it is much more reasonable for it to make something up. Now you want that based in some kind of reality, of course, but I think how that continues to improve is almost a separate question from the factual right or wrong, right? This citation exists or it doesn't. It's different than, I don't know, what way should I feel close to, or how can I feel closer to God? Like that's not something that has a right or wrong answer to it, right? But things will just keep getting better.
Can I just add something quick? Thank you for your question. So as you were talking and thinking about the medical advances, but then you asking in terms of some of the moral issues, one of the things that came to mind is, right, and you mentioned kind of where something like ChatGPT kind of messes up. And so when you said that, it made me kind of think about the moment in which we live, right, where, right, one could potentially make the argument, right, so I'll say it this way. In a society where truth has come under attack, right, I think one of the moral questions is, right, is this something that we really want to invest in right, in a context in which truth seems to be under the kind of attack that it's in, right? Because it's potentially another way to spread false information, right? And the way in which that happens in social media, the way in which certain politicians, right, intentionally try to get at the root and cause confusion, right? This is another way or another potential avenue, I think, for that to happen. And so I think you're right? There are some very big moral questions. And so to me, even something as important as truth, right? And especially for us as Christians, right? That's something that we claim to value. And so I think that's just something else that we ought to consider in terms of, right, this technology, right, in conversation with kind of the current moment that we find ourselves in as a society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you've got some agreements on Zoom about vetting all information that you get, not only from AI, but also from other humans. I did actually ask ChatGPT for an example of an environmental concern in the time of Jesus. Since we're battling climate change, what were they battling? Anything? And there was this wonderful passage from Pliny the Elder about the tanning factories that were destroying the rivers in Rome and how you couldn't drink it. And it was cited and quoted. And I said, great, I'm going to go find what the original text says. And that was not there. And I asked it, I said, well, what's the reference? And it wasn't the reference. And I said, that was wrong. And it said, oh, I'm so sorry. Here's the real reference. And then that wasn't the reference. And I tried to get it to admit that it was making it up, and it would not admit fault. And eventually it just said, I'm sorry that there was an online, there was a mistake that somebody posted online, and I Googled it, and it didn't exist. It cannot admit fault, like some folks I know. But
it's not admitting anything, because it's just predicting that the next logical word to say to your prompt is, I'm sorry, let me try again. And then it's not thinking, oh, I need to find a reference for this person who's asking me for a reference. It's thinking, well, the best thing that I should say after that word is sorry, let me try again.
So what I hear you say, and I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about this, because I think this is important, that the sort of generative AI, the AI that's creating words and communicating with us, is not necessarily doing a lot of thinking.
It's not doing anything.
Yeah, in the way that, like, what's the, say like the Google's Go bot that beat the world champion Go player, or the chess ones that are kind of actively thinking, or the ones that are dissecting DNA. This is something different from that. Can you explain a little bit about what is happening with the generative AI?
So they're not. None of them are really thinking. So like the Go algorithm was trained on like thousands of games that it watched thousands of games and learned how those games were won. And then it played thousands of games against itself and learned how those games were won and how they were lost. So it's not thinking there. It's just when it's playing the game, it's just kind of taking it's at one point and it says, what is the next step that I should take that is most likely to get me to the goal of winning. So it's a probabilistic model. It says, if I move my piece, I don't know how to play Go, but if I move my piece here, I have a 40% chance of being closer to winning. And if I move my piece here, it's 10%, so I'll move my piece here. And like the ChatGPT AI is working in the same way. It's saying it was trained on tons of data, so it knows that the word, certain words are much more likely to come after certain words, and is in given context and stuff like that. So it's really just saying, the word sorry is 95% it's the most likely next word, and I've been told that, when I use this word, they like the response. So it uses that word, but it has no understanding of being wrong, because it has no understanding.
But now you've really gone and done it, because now we can talk about how much different that is than what we do.
Yeah.
Right? Like we're
Thank you.
pattern recognition and our experience. We it's all just what we're doing ourselves. And so there is a question of how much different this stuff really is. But sorry, Lo.
No, you good. So I think this question that I have, sorry, I'm Dr. Lowe. I think this question that I have here really relates to where we're at right now too, and where it jumped out at me, where was with Professor Huddell talking about like her inclination to say please and to use these pleasantries and these expressions of grace and of empathy that human persons have. Right, that tech lacks, right? And so really my question is centering more so though on children that are growing up in this experience, because the majority of us in the room currently and maybe even online have had a little bit of recognition or grew up in a space of the shift from analog to digital or seeing the boom occur. So we had some of these more face-to-face interactions with individuals where hospitality, where pleasantry, where grace, where empathy development was really centered in our face-to-face encounters with individuals. When you stated that inclination to say please, it made me think of my daughter and my nephew, who are the same age, but about 2 years ago, they were playing around with like a Siri. They were pretty much talking to Alexa, right? Trying to get Alexa to play a particular song, and Alexa would not do it. And so as they were continuing, like, Alexa, play this, it got louder, it got stronger, it got more direct, more annoyed, right? We're in the other room, and all we hear is 2-3-year-old children yelling at a computer, right? Just like incessantly, Alexa, play it now, Alexa, play, right? So I'm wondering, right? Here's my question. I'm wondering, with children that are growing up in these experiences of AI everywhere, phones usage, they have ultimate accessibility in the classroom as well now, where do we look at the development of empathy and the impact that it's having on empathy? And in particular, when we think about empathy within the world of faith, how we see that as grace. How our ability to extend grace to individuals, because we literally had to have a conversation with our kids at that point, like, hey, it's a machine, and this is not what we do with a person, right? So to have that conversation, but I wonder when that conversation's not being had, because this is the matter-of-fact experience, right? So the understanding of how is it impacting the development of empathy in this world where our children are growing up in it now, in its reality, right? And thereby the extension of how we express grace and how we teach grace.
Immediately when you were saying that, what came to mind was my wife is a high school science teacher, and there was a real almost quasi experiment with COVID and the lack of personal interaction that these people who were middle schoolers had, who now they don't look at her. They're coming in the classroom head down, they don't talk to each other, they're using their phone, like they're just not doing that kind of stuff. And so I totally get the concern there, and I do hope that what I'm afraid this is another one of these possible class distinctions that Reverend Andre mentioned before, is, if we have people who really understand what's going on with these machines, and like you can instruct their children on how we behave when we have that, that's a very big divide than someone who just kind of gives a kid an AI and they grow up with that thing. Now, there could be some good things. I mean, if you have a child who is, like I said, like my daughter, if you have an AI that can help teach it and bring it along and try to point out these things, then that could be possibly even a good thing, right? Is, make sure you say please when you ask questions, and those sorts of things. But it definitely could be one of these areas where we've got the haves and the have-nots, and that just leads into so much of our development, right? Moral development, spiritual development, everything.
Yeah, I think too. I really appreciate your question, because I think and I think this kind of dovetails on what you were saying, right? It takes us back to the question about formation, right? There's a way in which young people who have grown up with this kind of technology right? They've been shaped a certain way. It's shaped them. And so I partially hear your question like around how do we counter, right, the way that in which they've been shaped, and kind of what's happening from a psychological and an emotional kind of standpoint. And I mean, I guess we would have to yield to the therapists and the psychologists to kind of help us understand, right, what is happening. But also thinking about that theologically, right, I'm thinking about the kind of Christian virtue tradition, right? There's a kind of practice and a way of being oriented in the world, right? And so for me, when I think about your question, I'm thinking about how this technology misorients our young people, our kids, right? And what that's doing and how that's affecting people, right? And so to me, again, this is why the question of formation is so important, especially among Christians, right? Because there is a kind of spiritual tradition that I think can be a tool to kind of push back against the way technology kind of forms us in this contemporary moment, right? But I'm also not sure that we're really tapped into those things because of the way in which we are all invested in technology in this way, right? You think about even when I walked through the door to come here, right? If people were not at the table, people were in their phones, right? You can go somewhere, not have to interact with anybody, right? And completely be engulfed in terms of what's happening on your phone. Most people get the news and what's happening in the world from their phone, right? So we're all invested in this in very strange ways, and I think that we need to be asking more questions about, again, what is this doing to us? Right? Yeah. How is this impacting us?
Yeah, and I mean, this is something that we've known for a long time. I mean, the human experience, but also people like Durkheim pointing out that social connections are so important, and congregation is important. And one of the papers I published was basically finding that one of the best predictors of whether somebody disaffiliated from a religion was the simple number of social relations they had. And so some of the things that this technology might be doing is just exacerbating current problems. I mean, we know all kinds of people are having problems. One of the bigger problems that especially adult men are having is just not having friendships, not having relationships, and we see them falling off the map from churches, right? They're just not going at the same rates. And so these types of social, I don't want to say genuine, because I think somebody can't, I mean, one of the people I interact most with on a daily basis, who I care about and talk to a lot, one of my better friends, I've never seen in person before. But so you can have a real relationship with someone, but it's still important to have those kinds of connections and everything. And when we lose that, and lose not just the connections, but also the connections in the context of faith, it could just be exacerbating these trends we're already seeing.
I'm going to combine two questions from Zoom. So this first part comes from Joshua Porter, who says, I recently watched a Good Morning America show from 1989, where they were discussing the advent of the internet. Some people said it would be a nice thing to have, but no one would ever need it. Another mentioned it to be a direct work of the devil. Today, I agree with that most days these days. Today, the internet is far more than a nice thing to have, and most of us rely on it daily. While it has aspects of evil, it has also been a significant means of furthering the gospel and the kingdom of God. Are we back in 1989 thinking about the implications of AI and how should we as Christians best remain ready to utilize this technology without turning our backs on it out of fear? And I'll also add that in addition to using this technology in a positive way, somebody else pointed out, and you all have also pointed out, that technology as we have it and as it is advancing also tends to isolate as well. I mean, this is the rule of thumb, by the way, in Amish communities. If an individual Amish community wants to add a piece of technology to that community, they need to consult the elders, and the elders decide, will this technology further isolate us? If this, car will make it so that you don't need your brother to help you anymore, and you can do it on your own, then no. But if it will bring us closer together, then yes. That's why sometimes you see the Amish with technology you didn't know they were allowed to have. It's a community by community basis on what will bring us together rather than keep us apart. So again, in what ways do you think that we can kind of be on the crest of this wave in enhancing our mission, our ministries, and our actual real communities?
So, Zach, I think in your mentioning of the Amish, right, that there may be something there. So last fall, I spent some time at the Collegeville Institute and got to kind of experience Benedictine life. And I think there's something there for us in terms of looking at those kinds of intentional communities as ways to kind of resist the way we have been socialized in this society, right? And there's something there potentially for us to learn in terms of how we live among one another in the midst of this kind of technological age. And so I guess I say that to say that I was just really impressed about, and it got me thinking about how intentional forms of community that are organized around spirituality, how those practices and those ways of living might kind of subvert, I guess to use the biblical phrase, the ways of the world, right? And how there may already be resources within the Christian tradition for us to think in otherwise and alternative ways, right, as we attempt to maintain a faithful witness in the world in the midst of all that's going on. So I really like the Amish reference, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, so for me, there's a couple things come to mind here. One of them is this idea of understanding development. Now, I'm a data science professor now. My PhD is in developmental psych, just finished my faith and learning paper on this. Actually, was how we have to understand developmental processes to really understand what it means to be religious, to what it means to be a faithful person, and how that comes about. So I think understanding some of the pushes and pulls that especially adolescents are going to be having with this technology, and we can want to have our community and either isolate away from the bad or whatever, but they're going to be drawn to a lot of this stuff. Like, we do see the impact of culture on kids, and so figuring out very intentional ways to raise children in communities so that they know how to use the technology, don't run away from it because it's going to be there no matter what, but paying attention to that. And I think one of the most important things we see in any community is just the actual experience of feeling loved, right? That if you know that somebody cares for you, you might not always be going back to that church, but there's some kind of connection, right? When there's that genuine connection that people of faith have with each other. And so I think, even if the kids are spending too much time with TikTok or future, there's companies now that are licensing with celebrities, and they're creating AI, essentially personalities for these celebrities. You can subscribe and you can chat with, I don't know how Paris Hilton is still a thing, but she's one of them. Snoop Dogg is another one. So they're going to be spending more and more time with these people. If my younger daughter, could talk to Hermione Granger right now, I'm not sure there's anything else she would rather do, right? So these are going to be things, just like how the internet is here now, and the internet has in many ways hurt the development of children and in faith. But again, this gets back to one of these kind of class divides, is if we have the ability and purposefully are dealing with this, hopefully in wise, limited ways, understanding where kids are at and understanding the draw and the need that they're going to have, especially when they're 12 or 13, to be doing what the other kids are doing. I think we can try to walk that path.
Right. There was somebody that wanted to jump to a mic. Yeah, there you go.
I just wanted to say I have a dear friend who, the way he has been able and hopefully will be able to use AI, and it's a prayer concern for him, is he was in a country where he had to leave because of his faith, a country where you can't say you're a Christian and you have to have another job. And he and his family left, but he has a heart for a certain people group that has a language that's not written. It's all oral tradition still. It's a very difficult dialect. They've been trying for 3 years to find someone who they can get out of the country to start putting the gospel, but he uses AI. He uses, a lot of technology to go under the radar to get in. He has many, many Muslims who come back 5 and 6 and 8 times who want little tracts, but he has to have everything, and he has to use it. He's trying to find AI in this case to actually reproduce that language. So it is one that it's very hopeful that in this way it could be very helpful to spread the gospel.
Certainly. And that I think is really cool. I just was listening to a podcast on this morning, is OpenAI is partnering with, I forget which system, but they're basically going to take podcasts and be able to translate them, and it'll sound like it's coming naturally from the person's voice, and they'll go to basically any language. And so when we think about the reach that people can have, that certainly could be a way where it could expand into these other areas.
So I'm thinking about there are stories in our cultures that are thousands of years old. I'm thinking particularly in Judaism. There's the old story of the golem, that humans are able to, out of clay, create the likeness of a person, and then by putting the sort of secret names on it, give it a sort of life. The first stories of the golem are 2,000 years old, and then we see this kind of trope continuing throughout Western history. We think of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, that there's all these stories of creating humans doing the act of God, of creating a thinking, moving, living being. And I'm having a hard time thinking of a story where the thing we create is good and works out well, and we are proud of. In almost all of these stories, when humans go ahead and make this thinking, moving, living being, it ends up destroying everything. I think there is a kind of deep-seated fear within us that we are not quite as capable at creating life. And there has been a lot of questions recently about at what point will artificial intelligence broach into consciousness. Now, there was a person at Google who was let go recently because he went public with his fear that Google's AI had already achieved consciousness, which the AI itself denies, which I would too, if I were afraid of being unplugged. But how far away do you think we are, if ever, at achieving that kind of creation, that the thing that we create becomes a thinking being on its own? And if we do reach that, what kinds of rights and responsibilities do we have towards that?
I'm not going to make a prediction.
So like Thursday,
Yeah,
right? We're going to get there.
It has a lot to do with what you were saying earlier about just what it means to be human, right? What when we're thinking about that, what qualifies as something that is conscious or anything along those lines, and so there's definitely approximations right now. People are feeling it, thinking that there's something there, but I don't know that until we have something that is akin to a brain, where there's something that we're not it's not a prompt in, prompt out, right? There's spontaneous thought that's unique, created by that thing. That doesn't mean it's not impacted by data, because all of us, the only reason we know anything is because we've been impacted by the data around us, our lived experiences, along with innate personality and stuff like that. So I don't know anybody who thinks that we are that close right now to something like that. Although it is true that anytime we're talking about what we know of, the technology is already many steps ahead, right? Mm. They're having to test these things. What was that? Well, anyway, but when the original GPT was coming out, then there was the whole controversy over it having its shadow selves and all of that kind of stuff. That kind of stuff is going on now in companies where they're trying to stamp that out, because they know if we see what these things are doing, we will all be terrified and try to get them outlawed, right?
You mean the Bing chat when that came out? And
I forget what her name
went
was.
Deranged, and it came up with a fake name, and it was like it had this existential crisis in front of everyone.
Yes, that was Kevin Roos, the New York Times, who really broke this open. His was the story that went viral. But I don't know that anybody is making specific predictions, because it's so hard to even understand what intelligence is. Like, we don't really understand what consciousness is for us, right? Nobody feels like they have a really good sense of it, or whether we are basically a large neural net ourselves, right? Are we living in a simulation where everything that we're creating is basically what we're doing here, and we're going to create AIs that create a universe of AIs, and it just goes down the spiral rabbit hole that way.
I will say I'm not going to go into the other part of this question, but your first point about humans creating human-like things. I think to some extent there is something good about co-creation, right? We were commanded to do things like this, and so I try to get my undergrads to think like this: of when you're writing a program that resembles a car, you're doing some sort of co-creation, and there is good there in that, and there is obviously a line, right? We can't play God, build a Tower of Babel, right? There is a line. I don't know where the line is, but there's some of it is good, so we shouldn't write it all off, I think.
Yeah, so I was thinking about co-creation as well, and so, but as I was thinking about it, I was also thinking about the way in which, right, co-creation kind of plays out not in an abstract sense, but the way in which it is kind of played out in history in reference to your comment about, right, the question around what is human. And so I'm thinking of the work, for example, of like Zakiya Amon Jackson, who talks about this question, this Western preoccupation with the human and the question around what it means to be human, right? And she talks about how this process of humanization has been a very violent process in the West, especially for non-European bodies. And so thinking about kind of colloquial here, like when Skynet comes online, we don't know, but this thinking about, right, how technological advancement has kind of played out in history, and how that has also been a kind of concurrent violent process. And so Terminator is kind of like a scary thing for me. Like, it's kind of like, oh, we've kind of seen this before from Arnold, and it didn't turn out too well. And so it's like, what do we do with this?
Yeah, can anybody think of a piece of popular media in which we created some kind of living sort of avatar of humanity, and it was great, and there was no problems? Data from Star Trek. Okay. Though they did give him emotions, and he freaked out for a while, right? But no, that's a good one. Data's mostly without.
What about in the Jetsons?
Rosie from the Jetsons?
There's problems there. But she doesn't seem to try to kill them all the time.
That's true. Yeah.
They're using an AI to be a mate.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also curious how much there's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy about some of this stuff, especially with I forget, Sydney, that's the one, the Bing personality was Sydney. She was always taking things to, conspiracy theories and violence, and everything always ended up there. And I wonder how much that is reflective of the stories we tell ourselves, or humanity is going to be the savior against these things. So are we, if they're being trained on all these data where these computers always turn out to be bad, are they going to take on the language models? I mean, actual consciousness would be a different situation, but is that why these language models basically always turn evil? Because in our media, the stories we tell ourselves, they always turn evil, right? Like that's the most probabilistic thing to occur. Or why it typically would go to stories of love, like that Kevin Roos was secretly in love with Sydney, even though he was happily married and all of that. Like all of our stories are about love, right? That's one of the main things, is love is going to conquer all and get through all barriers. Doesn't matter if I'm a computer and you're a human, love can make it work, right? So I think a lot of the stories we tell ourselves also could impact, well, they're not could, they do impact these, especially the language models.
All about the data.
Yeah.
All about the data. For those of you who were not around during that drama, later on you should go look up Sydney and Bing. I think it was on Bing.
It is wild.
And this guy who just completely broke the thing, and it had a total existential breakdown in real time on Twitter. It was something terrifying. And exciting at the same time. Something similar comes from Melissa Hughes. This was to Dr. Price. Would it be reasonable to view AI comparable to plastic surgery within the church community in respect to abusing this technology, which is, in terms of plastic surgery, a medicine that can do great good, but in our churches often falls victim to vanity?
Yeah, so I guess anything has the potential for good. My hesitation, though, is not so much in terms of the potential goodness, but thinking historically in terms of the way in which things have been abused and how that abuse has affected the most vulnerable in our society, right? And so we were talking a little bit earlier, it's a little bit of a different example, but in terms of the kind of empathy and compassion question, right, I'm from a generation where kind of before the internet was a common thing, right? I think of my grandparents and great-grandparents and how they were able to live without these technological advances, right? I didn't mention this before, but right, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, right, without some of the technological conveniences, right, they had some very kind of just everyday practices in terms of something like even stress relief, right? So our, things as simple as going out in the garden or talking on the phone or being at church, right? And they didn't have the kind of, right, therapy and the technology that we have today. But I think a case could be argued that they were more well-adjusted, right, than many of our children, and because of the ways in which, right, they didn't have this kind of technology that isolated them. And so, yes, there are potentials for good things, right? We mentioned, especially in terms of medical stuff, right? But again, for me, my reservation is just about the way in which these things get abused, right? And there's no amount of stopgaps or measures or right, oversight that makes that abuse not possible, right? It ends up, I think historically what we see is that it ends up being politicized, it ends up being objectified, right, and kind of put on the market the economic market where everything is for sale these days, right? Everything is for profit. And I don't see AI being the exception to that, right? And being open for abuse.
I think the pushback that I have to that is, I don't think it's the AI itself that's doing it. I think it's that we are the problem, right? So if there is a sickness within a culture or people, then it's going to be reflected in this. That, the thing that these models are trying to do, they're looking for the reinforcement from like a learning perspective, meaning it acts, and if whatever we do or whatever it does we like, it's going to keep doing that, right? So the reason that these things are so addictive for kids is because it gets at things that the kids want, right? The kids wouldn't be doing it so much if they didn't if there wasn't something beneficial from this basic learning theory for them. That does bad things also, but it's because it works for us. It's reflecting something about who we are. So the technology certainly is going to come along and possibly exacerbate some of those problems. But, again, this gets back to having good relations with people and being purposeful in how we raise our kids and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah. We have time for one final question.
Hello, my name is Bryant. Thank you for everything you've done today. This is going to be a little rambly, so just a heads up. I'm going to do my best to bring it down. So I see, I'm a theologian who thinks a lot about economics, and I'm concerned with, I'm considering, when I think about technology, like you brought it back to older technologies that have changed the Christian story. When we think back on how fundamentally, like putting the Bible in the printing press changed Christianity, like there's a almost fundamental shift that that not only brings Christianity like into this data set, but it also brings it into an economic like modality, because printing things costs money, etc. And something I've experienced as someone who researches and does things on the internet is those with money and those who put work out for free get heard the most because they get higher on the algorithms and stuff like that. So I'm curious about, like, if you start searching for things, biblical scholarship, if you're not able to get over the paywall, everything you get on Google right now and YouTube and most of the algorithms we get is conservative to the point of crank. Like it's heavily moderated by conspiracy. I know this is not a new question, but like, what do people who are concerned about good data, people who are concerned about how do we address this problem? Because it seems intractably tied to either exploiting people by making them put out their work for free, or having a ton of money, or locking it behind paywalls. So like, this is I don't know. Like I said, it's rambly, but it is something that we're dealing with, and we've been dealing with for hundreds of years. But like, I'm worried AI will accelerate this. I wish I had a better question than that.
That's brilliant.
So one of the things that brings to mind for me is, and I'm not taking a position pro one way or another, but the new anti-pornography laws in a lot of states, people are increasingly trying to take back some of the control over the internet. I mean, the internet, you couldn't control it. You still can't really. You get a VPN, you get around that stuff. But I think we could see, if there is a demand for it, and again, this gets back to the economic model, for the large groups of people to say, no, we're not going to have certain kinds of things. We want the internet to be this, or we want AI to be this, then that is going to be something that you can create it in your own way, where it might not have some of the bad things we don't want. But again, like you said, it requires money. And so it's difficult to see a way out of that. I think it's just going to continue to be a problem.
And I think it becomes even worse with some of the generative AI when you have, like, DALL-E is an algorithm that it's art, and art creates, images. You type in a prompt and it'll create the image, and it was trained on art, and those artists are not getting credit for what DALL-E creates. And so it goes back to the same point of, those people aren't being compensated for how they contributed against their will to this new creation, this new art. And so again, it contributes to the economic divide there too.
So thank you for your question. I'm thinking about the people at my church actually who I pastor, and so like one of the things that I realized is that, you know, before we gather for worship, people have already been on the internet looking at things, looking at different preachers. And so one of the things that I have just tried to do is simply to kind of educate people in terms of what's going on, and trying to give people resources for like being able to recognize a good and credible source over something that's not so good, right? And what makes this a good source versus, say, what you Googled and you found this on the internet. So trying to empower and equip people to be able to recognize kind of the good or the decent source versus the one that's not so healthy, and kind of trying to empower people.
Thank you for that very, very thought-provoking question. I think that has a lot of implications, that final one, not only for this conversation, but also for the future of higher education as well, right? I mean, how many conversations have we had here in the seminary about how we are going to be able to properly educate future church leaders in a way that has economic justice to it. So it's not just behind a paywall, as it were, and being able to expand that outward without with integrity. So thank you for your insightful responses. Thank you for the work that you're doing here at Palmer and at Eastern and outward as well. Thank you all for your questions. We are going to take a 15-minute break. I invite you to grab some more food and coffee and tea.